So this is a serious concern in veterinary medicine. As we know, we don't have to, read the headlines. We can look to our own practices and the people who we know in this community, that mental illness and mental health issues have been a significant problem in veterinary medicine. It's well documented that veterinary medicine, or veterinarians and veterinary technicians, have one of the highest suicide rates among professionals and paraprofessionals. The level of mental burnout, the degree of mental stress among veterinary professionals is something that's really unparalleled by other professions. I think, in the space of the current pandemic, the degree of mental stress and the challenges to veterinary medicine have only been amplified. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we can reclaim some of that wellness through the way we communicate with each other. So when we think about well-being, it really is sort of this multifaceted, multidimensional concept. And it really does look different from one person to the next. So well-being for you may not look like what well-being is for your colleague or for your friend. I know that there are things that without them in my personal life, I don't have a sense of balance. I don't have that full sense. I can't fully appreciate that sense of well-being. But there are some common ones to veterinary professionals. Obviously, physical health, it goes without saying that your physical health, when you have physical health, that is one component of your overall mental health. If you're concerned about illness or injury, whatnot, that can take its toll on your sense of well-being. Work-life balance, which is, it's so interesting because back in the day when I first started out, even before I became a veterinary technician, this notion of work-life balance, I always thought, I am not doing this very well because I'm working all the time, and I feel like I should be, doing more fun stuff, more non-work related things. But the fact is that work-life balance is not a 50-50 equation. It's not a 50-50 balance. If you are able to achieve that, God bless you. But on some days, work-life balance is 80% life, family, and 20% work. And sometimes it's the middle of a Wednesday afternoon and you say, you know what, that is it, I have to go. So it really is something that is incredibly personal. But the sense of the importance of work-life balance to overall well-being cannot be understated. Professional satisfaction. In the United States, one of the first things you ask someone when you meet them at a party is, so what do you do? We don't say, so how many dogs do you have? Or what kind of car do you drive? Or what was the last thing you ate last night? We tend to go to what do you do as a way of meeting and interacting with other individuals, which really does speak to the fact that our professional lives are a tremendous part of our overall lives. And when you don't have that professional satisfaction, it really can bring you down. I happen to live in New York State. I work for Zoetis, and Zoetis is headquartered in Parsippany, New Jersey. So it's about 70 miles from where I live. And when I tell people, I drive an hour and 15 each way to work, they always go, oh my gosh, it's too much. But actually those 2.5 hours, almost 3 hours that I get alone in the car with myself every day are absolutely critical, because I'm able to decompress on the way home from work. And I'm able to process things that would otherwise trip me up. So that sense of professional satisfaction, sometimes it's on a day-to-day basis, and other times it really is sort of, over a span of time. I have professional satisfaction, but I know that it's something that it doesn't just automatically appear. It's something that we really do have to conscientiously work at. Financial health, if you're concerned about, bills and ends not meeting, that can take a tremendous toll. And then the sense of belongingness. And I wanted to talk a little bit about belongingness because it really does go hand in hand with what I'm going to speak to today. When you feel like you're part of a community, when you feel like you're connected with your colleagues, that you have a role in your profession, that you have a role in your practice or your company or your institution, wherever it is that you're working, that sense of belongingness is absolutely integral to well-being. The idea that I would show up somewhere every single day and spend 8 hours or 9 hours or sometimes 12 hours there, and I don't feel connected to that, can absolutely undermine well-being. And it really does go to the heart of what I'm going to talk about as we get further into this presentation. And so the reason why I'm focusing on cultural competencies and microaggressions is because our country is more diverse now than it has ever been. With that diversity comes new cultural influences, new artistic influences, all sorts of implications for diversity. And it really does make us a stronger either country or in our individual practices or in institutions. Diversity really does strengthen the cords of what it is that we do. Now, the challenge with this being, why this is such an issue in veterinary medicine, is because the demographics of the country look like this. So just over 60% of the country is Caucasian, or they identify themselves as Caucasian. You can see almost 20% identify as Hispanic or Latino, and African Americans are at 13.4%. This is census data from 2018. The country looks like this. Our profession looks like this. So we operate as part of a veterinary profession that does not necessarily, it doesn't mimic the larger society that we serve. And this can be a problem because in some situations when individuals don't see themselves represented in a particular space, they don't feel themselves to be welcome in that space, or they don't feel like they have a sense of belonging. And this is something that can happen with us as veterinary technicians. It's something that veterinarians experience, but it's also something that our clients are experiencing. And one of the challenges becomes, well, if our clients don't feel that their interests are understood, or that this is a welcome place to bring their animal, then they're more likely than not to bring, they're more likely to not bring their animal. And so there are implications for overall patient care as well. Now, the notion of underrepresented in veterinary medicine, this is a terminology that was developed by the American Association of Veterinary Medical Colleges. And it really is an important discussion because what this basically means is that the profession isn't advancing commensurate with the changing demographics of the country. Veterinary medicine has historically been rife with underrepresented individuals. These are people who are disproportionately impacted by some very specific parameters, and have, in many ways, this is manifested in the fact that you don't see very many people of color, very many people of various cultures joining the profession. Gender, race, ethnicity, geographic issues, so there are issues with rural veterinary medicine, socioeconomic challenges, and educational disadvantages. Now, these are a whole bunch of this is data driven, this is survey driven, this is, there are many organizations within veterinary medicine that are taking the pulse of the profession to determine exactly how it is and why it is that that the profession isn't attracting individuals with multiple or from multiple backgrounds and cultures and ethnicities. But there are some very unique experiences that individuals from underrepresented groups have in veterinary medicine. You guys are going to learn over the next hour or 2 hours that I am very big on telling stories. I have a million stories from the field as a veterinary technician. And so I tend to remember every story that I can't remember what happened yesterday, but I can remember what happened in like in 2003. It's ridiculous. But there are some very unique experiences that underrepresented individuals have being in veterinary medicine. There's a subtle sense of isolation. I will share clearly, you can see on the screen, I am an African-American female. And one of the things that struck me when I started practicing as a veterinary technician was I was always the only African-American female in that practice or on that faculty. So there's a subtle isolation where, while we have common challenges in veterinary medicine, there are some things that others couldn't appreciate fully because it was something that was so unique to me as the underrepresented individual. So when I started working with Hills, one of the things that I was doing was I was traveling to vet tech programs in the northeast component of the northeast corner of the country. And I was speaking on all different sorts of small animal nutrition topics. And I remember visiting a school in Pittsburgh, and there were probably 50 students in this particular class. I had done a presentation on, I don't know, pet food label reading or something like that. And there was a young African-American student who was lined up with a couple of other students at the end of the presentation. They wanted to ask me questions. And she was on the phone at the time. And I remember as she got closer and closer to me, she was kind of, antsy, dancing back and forth or whatever. But I guess there was something going on. And she was on the phone with her mom. And as she got up to me, I heard her say, "Oh my gosh, Mom, this lady just came from Hills to speak to us. And oh my gosh, Mom, she's Black." And I remember in that moment, I didn't fully appreciate the impact of that. I mean, we don't typically, do that for, unless someone has like 6 heads, we're not typically taken aback by, their culture or their ethnicity. And I did not at the time appreciate why that was such a notable thing for her until it was much later. And what happens is when you don't see yourself represented, you don't feel that it's an attainable thing for you. So the fact that she had the experience of encountering another African-American individual was noteworthy to her. So there's a subtle isolation. Another thing is that a lot of work has gone into making veterinary medicine as a profession more accessible to more individuals. The American Veterinary Medical Association, AAVMC, AHA, all of this organized veterinary medicine has done a lot to expose individuals of underrepresented groups to veterinary medicine, teaching young children about veterinarians and veterinary technicians of different backgrounds. And so while the profession is still largely and majorly, not majorly, but largely homogenous, we have made some strides. So we're starting to see numbers of underrepresented individuals, greater numbers joining the profession. And so what happens is we tend to start celebrating the statistics. We have, 6% African Americans this year versus 4% last year. And so we start to celebrate the statistics, but one of the challenges is that the individual story often gets lost in that. So while we may have, 0.5% more representation of Asian individuals or of people who identify as Latino or Hispanic, if you happen to be the only one in your practice or the only one in your particular organization, a lot of your individuality gets lost in that statistic. So it becomes a challenge. There's also issues of invalidation, where you may have a discussion with someone and they may say something that is a slight to you, and then you bring it to their attention and it's sort of poo-pooed. It's sort of, you're making a big deal out of nothing. So it basically invalidates your instinctive response to that. And then there are unique stressors. Again, that really just speaks to a lot of the things I just talked about, the unique stressors of those who are not represented as part of the majority. The other thing is that there's implications for patient care for this. One good, I think, talking point right here is that the Latino population is going to account for approximately half the growth in U.S. pet owners between now and 2021, or actually between 2016 and 2021. And this means that this has implications not only for the veterinary profession on a marketing side, but it also has implications for how we go to work, how we go about doing our particular jobs. Again, in situations where you don't feel that the service is there. You don't feel that the service there fully appreciates the unique situations related to your individual case that may emanate from your culture or your cultural practices, then you're not likely to take your animals to the veterinarian, which means that they're not getting the care that they necessarily need. And so the issue of cultural competency is really important here. And cultural competency doesn't require that you learn every nuance of every individual who comes into your practice. It just means that you have to be consciously aware that culture really isn't separate from the way we operate. And so you may have situations where your interaction with a particular client may not necessarily go the way you want, or this client may not necessarily be as compliant as you would like, and that there's a cultural component to that. So I'll talk a little bit about that as we go further on. Now, culture is important because it really does shape how we value and how we explain the world to ourselves. It basically forms the lens through which we see the world. And no matter who you are, we all have blind spots. We're talking about microaggressions, and one of the things I should probably back up and say is that this isn't something that is unique and exclusive to one particular group. This is, everybody has a blind spot. And these blind spots are, it causes us to sort of recognize our own conscious and unconscious beliefs and our biases and language around how we interact with our colleagues and how we interact with our particular clients. So let's get into our microaggressions. I did lay the foundation for that, I think. Dr. Durald Wing Su is a psychologist who works at Columbia University, and he's written extensively on microaggressions, and not just what they are, but how they are manifested, where they come from, the different nuances of microaggressions, and how they impact the individual on the receiving end. So he defines it, as you guys can see on the screen, as brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, environmental indignities, whether they're intended or not, that communicate, something just popped up, that communicate a hostile or derogatory negative slight and insult to the target individual or group. Now, there are different shades of microaggressions. Whoops, went the wrong way there. Different shades of microaggressions. When we think about racial microaggressions, I can personally attest to having experienced several of these things. And oftentimes they come off as seemingly innocuous statements, but the impact that they have on the individual is really where the damage, if you will, can occur. Things like, what do your people think of that? Or, what are you? I've gotten that on a couple of occasions. What are you? And I'm thinking, human, female, that kind of thing. And I'll share another experience with you. Before I became a veterinary technician, I worked on Wall Street in New York. And we had a situation at the company that I worked at where there was an employee dispute between two individuals, one of whom had mental illness. And the employee who had the mental illness was actually the aggressor in this situation. He had done something absolutely egregious against another colleague, and so the company was looking to dismiss him, but they wanted to make sure that they crossed all their T's and dotted all their I's. And so they called every single one of the members of our group up to human resources individually. And so the vice president, the highest ranking human resource officer in the organization, was talking with me about my experiences with this particular individual. And he said, so tell me what you know about the situation between, let's say, Joe and Tom, use their names. And I started telling him, what my experiences were. And he got this really quizzical look on his face. And he goes, where are you from? And I thought it was, because I grew up in Ohio in the Midwest, and I was in New York City, and I guess I had a twang. So I said, oh, I grew up in Ohio. So that's where my accent comes from. And he goes, no, like, where are you from? What do you like? Where are you from? And I said, I am from Ohio. O-H-I-O, I'm from Ohio. He goes, no, it's just that you speak so well. And I remember in that moment being utterly stunned, because this was the highest ranking human resources officer, and I had no one I could even take that grievance to. He was the highest ranking human resources officer. So that shocked me. And then I thought to myself, I'm speaking the same English that you speak. It was, and I know that I don't think that his intent was malignant. I don't think that he intended to be rude, but that happened in 1995. And every time I replay that in my head, it sticks with me. So racial microaggressions can come out. They can manifest in a bunch of different ways. And the way that they land is really where the challenge comes. So now at the basis of microaggressions are biases, and we all have them. No one is immune from having biases. It isn't something that only one group has. We have them by virtue of the fact that we're human beings and we're influenced by so many things environmentally. But biases are divided between implicit and explicit. So implicit biases generally are things that we're not consciously aware of. These are things that you may feel a particular way, or you may, it doesn't necessarily align with your belief. They're really generally couched in stereotypes or understandings about a particular group or particular individual that's not necessarily based on truth. You juxtapose it with explicit bias, and explicit bias is the exact opposite. It's when you're consciously holding a belief about a particular group, even if it's not true, or specifically if it's not true. They're generally born of a sense of being threatened, a sense of feeling that something is being taken away from you, or a sense that something about your life is going to change by virtue of another person who they essentially are, based on culture, based upon sex or gender, based upon ethnicity or nationality. Generally, what happens in these situations with explicit situations is people tend to draw their lines. I'm going to sort of shrink back to my group, and I'm going to distinguish myself from the other individual based upon that explicit bias. There's 3 categories of microaggressions. I'm going to talk, let's see here, there we go. Microaggressions. So the first version is, or the first form, are microassaults. And these are generally the most overt forms of discrimination. They're conscious, it's deliberate, you intended it. It can be subtle or overt. So it can be passive aggressive, or it can be in your face, but this is something that you absolutely intended to do. It's generally communicated to a marginalized group. Now, marginalized groups are not limited to cultural and ethnic differences. Marginalized groups can be women in an all-male environment. And a lot of times we'll see this in research situations where, especially male-dominated research situations, where female researchers or female veterinary professionals are oftentimes on the receiving end of these things. So examples of, it's a shame that you decided to have kids in vet school, you really could have gone far. Or, you can't be a real scientist if you believe in God. Those 2 things cannot coexist. A micro insult is a little bit different. Oftentimes these are unconscious and they're rude, but they still cast a negative light on particular characteristics. So the example of that I just told you about my experience on Wall Street, where the human resources officer said, "Well, you really speak well." I still laugh at it, but it's a situation that conveys, it's communication that conveys some kind of stereotype, whether you believe that inherently or not, okay? And then finally, a micro invalidation, and this is basically a nullification of someone's feelings. And I've seen this in not only in microaggression situations, but I've seen a friend of mine, her son fell and he was crying. He was a little kid and he was crying. And she said, "That's nothing to cry about. I'll give you something to cry about. That's nothing to cry about." Well, I mean, it was something to cry about for him because he hurt himself and he's a little kid. So it's basically an invalidation of what you felt. So, someone's saying, racism isn't a problem at this school. We don't have to deal with that. Or women are treated fairly in our practice. We don't really have issues with, pay inequity or opportunity inequity in our institution. Or I don't know why everything is race to you. Why does everything come through the lens of race? So it basically invalidates the inherent and intrinsic feeling of the individual who is on the receiving end of it. Now, as I mentioned a couple times, microaggressions are not limited to underrepresented groups. You can be a member of the majority, if you will, and still be on the receiving end of microaggressions or invalidation. One example is I had a student once who, she's Christian, and they were talking about, it was a biology lesson. It was so long ago. It was a biology lesson, and the issue of, or the theory of evolution came up. And she said, she raised her hand and she said, well, she doesn't believe in evolution. She's a Christian and she believes in creationism. And she caught the brunt of nearly every student in the class. This was a class of all Caucasian students. So the notion that microaggressions only impact underrepresented groups, you can be a member of the majority and still be on the receiving end of it. If another example is if you have a gay or lesbian sibling or family member, and while you may have the same cultural or the same ethnic similarities as everyone around you, if they're making jokes or they're saying derogatory things against gays and lesbians, that's something that is going to be an assault against you. So let's look at the intersection of microaggressions and well-being. I'm going to tie this all back to where we originally started out. The fact of the matter is that microaggressions have an impact on so many different areas of our professional journey, not just us as veterinary technicians, practicing veterinary technicians, or if they're veterinary technician students here, but it has implications for our academic success. It has implications for our learning experience. There are implications for how we function day to day in our interactions with our colleagues. It has implications on our mental well-being as well as our physical well-being. There's data, there's documented data that show the impact, the physical, quantifiable, and qualitative impact of microaggressions on individuals of underrepresented groups. When we think about learning, microaggressions can really create sort of a culture of conditions that impede the sense of belongingness, that impede the sense of engagement. A lot of times, students who are experiencing this, or maybe even if it's faculty members, they actually, there's a shift of the cognitive focus from the task at hand to process the perceived slight. Instead of focusing on what it is that you're supposed to be learning, or focusing in on the didactic or the clinical education that you're supposed to be doing, you're literally shifting your thoughts away to process over and over again what someone said to you, or what someone implied to you, or a statement that was directed at you. And so because you're constantly shifting and mulling it over in your head, a lot of times you're missing out on the academic experience. The notion of imposter syndrome, the sense of, and this is another one of those unique situations, the sense of a member of an underrepresented group, the sense that they may have I really don't belong here. I only got this position because they needed to increase diversity, or I'm really not good enough to be here, but they needed to increase the number of women in this situation, or in this particular environment. Or I'm not as good as my Caucasian, of my Caucasian counterparts, or as my counterparts, or whoever the majority is. And so that sense of imposter syndrome is really insidious, and it undercuts not only your ability to function well, but it also undercuts your ability to thrive, because you're constantly second guessing yourself. And then there's something called stereotype, and individuals of an underrepresented group will experience this oftentimes, where you will purposely change your behavior so that you don't manifest a perceived stereotype about your particular group, right? So if your particular, ethnic group, or your particular nationality affiliation you have is stereotypically known for something, some aspect, some idiosyncrasy, or some, characteristic, even if it's not true, you will purposely act the exact opposite so that you don't bring that stereotype to fruition. You don't give the general population a sense that stereotype is true. And this takes a lot of, I call it the mental jujitsu of navigating this. It's exhausting because you feel like you're constantly having to become someone who you aren't inherently, just to avoid the potential of being on the receiving end of some of the challenges. With respect to sciences and veterinary medicine overall, there's higher attrition rates of people, of underrepresented students, than there are with students of the majority. And so one of the challenges is that while all these organizations like AVMA and AAVMC are doing all that they can, and are doing initiatives and all sorts of outreach to increase diversity and inclusion in veterinary medicine, because of the high rate of attrition for all the different reasons that I talked about before, it's sort of two steps forward and one step back. And so it makes it a challenge to counter the demographic disparities. Then the issue of mental wellness, and that really comes back to why, you know, I wanted to talk about microaggressions as a component of well-being. There is a sense of increased isolation. You can be, you know, I've been in conferences where I may not have seen another African American for a couple of days, and when I finally do, it's like, oh my gosh, it's almost like a unicorn. And these, you know, this conference with a good, you know, 3,000-4,000 people. There's a sense of isolation because we are inherently we're inherently drawn to each other. We're inherently drawn to people who are like us. And I probably have a lot in common with a lot of you sitting in the audience, culturally or cultural or ethnicity notwithstanding. But because of our inherent human nature is to be drawn to like things, we may never get to know that. So there's higher levels of stress and anxiety, hypervigilance. Again, and this goes back to the stereotype threat, looking to avoid that. Negative self-esteem. It can be challenging because one of the, you know, I'll speak for me individually. You know, one of the lessons that I learned very early on from my parents was that in order for me to be as good as my Caucasian counterparts, and this was true whether it was high school, elementary school, college, whatever, was that I had to work twice as hard to be just as good. And so that sense of constantly having to strive, it's exhausting. And there is there's a correlation between that mindset and increase in depression and depressive symptoms. I've experienced all of that. Specifically in African Americans, there is quantifiable data that shows that the impact of racism-related stress on the psychological distress is actually greater than that of life stress. And so I know that information is not true just for African Americans. I would venture to say comfortably that any member of an underrepresented group, regardless of what that group is, has probably experienced that as well. And then there are physical manifestations for this as well. Prolonged increased levels of cortisol, stress hormones in the bloodstream. We know, you know, we are science-driven individuals. We are veterinary medical professionals. We know the impact of stress hormones long-term on well-being, and it's physically, it's not compatible with good physical health. It's been like one particular study looked at 3,100 African Americans, Latinos, and Caucasian people and found a correlation between the hypervigilance caused by race-based stress and a higher incidence of heart disease. So we know this is not just a mental thing, there are physical ramifications for this. And then social well-being. One study looked at somatic symptoms in a group of Asian Americans and found as the sense of isolation or the sense of malignment or their perception of microaggressions increased, there was a correlated increase in somatic symptoms and negative affects. And so, you know, there's perceived discrimination. It influences group dynamics and group-based anger. So there are, you know, as you can see, you know, just from the physical, from the social, from the mental well-being, from the academic learning experience, microaggressions really are insidious. And they really do sort of undercut us having our very best professional experience. So we know what they are, we know how they impact us, and now let's talk a little bit how we address them. The fact of the matter is, that was okay on time. The fact of the matter is that this is something that we can't push under the rug. The goal here is to make the invisible, make the invisible visible. And how do we do that? So let's look at what we do when, when we're dealing with microaggressions. When you're on the receiving end of that microaggression, consider the context first and foremost. Undistort the distortion. Because a lot of times when we're sort of in that hypervigilant state, we can hear something, and while the intent was not malicious, while the delivery was not malicious, because we're so sensitive to that particular thing, the way we process it can be skewed, and so the context can be thrown off, and that would impact how we would choose to respond. Take care of yourself. If you are in a negative situation, and I'm speaking to you, if you are a student, if you are a technician on the floor, if you are in a corporate situation, take care of yourself. If you're in an environment where you're constantly receiving, you're on the receiving ends of these slights, speak up for yourself, first and foremost. We are constantly teaching people how to treat us. And so while I don't believe that we should always be hitting every tennis ball back across the court that comes to us, there are some tennis balls that it's necessary to hit because you need to drive home a message. If someone is speaking to you in a derogatory way, it is absolutely your right, 100%, to tell them that that is unacceptable and that you won't take that. You won't engage with them at all. You don't have to engage with them. Because we're teaching people how to treat us, when that first slight comes across and it is overt, it is clear as day what they meant, if you don't teach them that that is an unacceptable way to engage with you, they're going to feel emboldened to do it again. And so it's really important for you to take care of yourself by advocating for yourself. Okay? Don't be fooled by microaggressions packaged as opportunities. I've had this experience a lot. I've had this experience a lot where I may have been the sole African-American in a particular situation, and I was given the job or the task of finding out something specifically about African-Americans. I have access to the exact same information as everybody else in the world, and because I'm African-American, I don't necessarily have to be the person who does all the research on African-Americans, and it's the same thing for women. And if you're a male in a female-dominated environment, this goes true for you as well. What do men think about this? I don't know. You're not every single man, right? And so the notion that you speak for the entirety of your particular group is something that you probably want to push back on. When you're a bystander, when you see these things happen, when you have that colleague who is being bullied, you have that colleague who is constantly taking slights from other individuals, be an ally to them, but speak for yourself. You shouldn't have to feel like you have to come to their defense, but wrong is wrong, whether it's happening to you or it's happening to someone else. And so when you speak up, it's not, you shouldn't be speaking to that person that way, or, who do you think you are talking to her like that? You speak for yourself. You say, I'm offended that you would speak to another member of our team that way, or I'm offended and I'm insulted, or I'm insulted, that you would say such a hurtful thing to a member of our team. So you're speaking up for yourself. You're being an ally for the individual, but through your own lens. And then finally, if you're the microaggressor, and I guarantee you every single one of us has been at some point, whether we're consciously aware of it or not, try not to be defensive. If someone tells you that they were hurt by something you said, or someone told you that, the way that you spoke with them was insensitive, you don't get to take that away from them. I think sometimes out of, shock, sometimes we tend to go to the defensive. But acknowledge their hurt, acknowledge that their feelings are, whether you agree with them or not, they are their feelings. And so the way that you drive the conversation forward, and the way that you go about being a part of the solution to the problem, is by acknowledging and giving legitimacy to what they experienced. Project Implicit, I think this is a great tool. I would challenge all of you guys, or encourage all of you guys to check it out. I'll leave the link up here so you can copy it down, but it's a project through Harvard University. I believe there are several components of it that are free, and it's something that you yourself can take. It allows you to just sort of take your own pulse, which is important here, because none of us wants to think that we have explicit bias tendencies or implicit bias tendencies, but the truth of the matter is that we're all human and we all have them. And if there's an issue on your team, or if there's an issue in your practice, or on your faculty, challenge yourself to understand and be brave enough to find out if you might be part of that challenge, or if you may be part of the problem. I think as our profession grows in diversity, as it should, as our clientele becomes more and more diverse, and we start to reap the benefits of the richness of different cultures, I think it's important for us to sort of do a gut check every blue moon, just to make sure that we really are creating an inclusive and involved environment for everybody. Okay, so I think, I'm not sure where I am on time. I am at 45 after the hour, so I will turn it back over to Kirsten. Oh, oh, I can just answer the questions directly from the Q&A?
Yeah, so I was going to read them for you if that works.
Yeah. Yes,
Unless
Tanisha, it is.
yes. So several people wanted to comment that they really identified with what you were saying about microaggressions, and it was really helpful for them to hear it. So
Yes.
I will mark all of those.
Okay.
We do have a question. I'm glad that I'm taking this course because I'm a deaf veterinary technician and I've always dealt with microaggression from clients and another form of vet tech.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, what is the next step if that person continues to insult you after asking them to stop?
So I'm assuming that you are in practice and there's a practice manager. And ideally, I hope that your practice has protocols in place for grievance protocol in place. You can ask that person to stop, and it's up to them to choose whether they stop or not. But if they choose not to stop, there should be ramifications. And so my recommendation was, if you've documented that you've gone to this individual, you've told them multiple times to stop, and they won't, my recommendation is to escalate it to your practice manager or whoever is the next sort of individual in charge. I don't know if it will be your head tech or how your hospital is made up, but you absolutely should address that. And I will say, in a worst case scenario, if you brought this to the attention of your practice manager or your practice owner and they still didn't do anything, I would go outside of the practice. I'm not saying leave your job. I'm saying I would seek remunerance, or I would seek grievance through the equal opportunity employment infrastructure. Because this is something that if the hospital is condoning it, then the hospital is the problem. And I wish you success.
Thank you, Garnett.